Welcome back, guys. I'm your host, David Dono. Today we have on a different type of guest, not necessarily a golfer, maybe not even necessarily a sporty or athletic type of guy, but he's a creator and he's doing cool things with his podcast, and he has a book coming out soon. Ryan Williams, how are you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Man, I have so much I want to talk with you about, but as always, we'll get to what we get to. And my first question is to just honestly to see what type of person you are. Crunchy peanut butter or smooth? Why?
Well, I'd like to first of all say that I am a golfer, and I used to be a sporty person. So let's put that on the record to start with. But I'm no longer as athletically inclined. I play basketball every once in a while. But yes, to answer your question, I like crunchy all the way, 100%, without doubt. You want substance to your peanut butter. Peanut butter is something that sometimes is not easy to digest, which is why it goes well with jelly and bread, because it's complementary. You like having just a spoonful of plain peanut butter is not delicious, but having chunky with the peanuts in the actual peanut butter, it adds texture to it and helps you to digest.
Yeah, so there. I mean, I 100% agree. Well, I mean, I must say, I didn't know that you were a golfer. I mean, as far as being sporty, let's be honest. If you're not being paid to play a sport, give it up. You're not sporty, right? I mean, let's graduate to reality there. So let's start with the influencer economy. Tell us about the podcast that you created early last year, early 2014. It's blown up over the past less than 6 months, I would say, right?
Yeah, it's going like gangbusters at this point. We were just number 3 in business in all of iTunes, and number 102 in all of podcasts. And getting a lot of great feedback from listeners, from the guests, and really it's like this passion I've had around the influencer economy has been years in the making. And like anyone launching a product or an idea right now, it takes so long to get your idea to people and to let them touch it and be a part of the community that you're trying to cultivate. And so I've been a startup entrepreneur for 7 years, and based in Los Angeles. And I had a baby girl a year ago. She's 15 months now. And right when I had the baby, I had worked for startups, which you're essentially married to startups for anyone that has been a part of one. And I left the startup world. At one point, I was a Disney executive because our company was acquired by Disney, and I worked for a startup, Machinima, which was valued at $200 million when I left. And then I went to a company called State, which was in London. I ran our U.S. marketing and had a very successful track record with startups. And I said, you know what, I can't look at my daughter, in 10 years and not tell her I didn't go on my own to launch my idea. And the stories from the influencer economy has been something that's been brewing in me for years. And it's all about do-it-yourself entrepreneurship, being a creator, just making stuff as you go along to build a bigger idea. And it's multi-platform. It's going to be a larger book, The Influencer Economy, that's coming out later this year. It's the weekly podcast where I talk to creators like Bernie Burns, from the YouTube world, to writers like Adam Grant of Give and Take, to filmmaker, podcast hosts like Brian Koppelman. And what I'm realizing is there's such a common thread with me and you even. We're trying to build and go out after our ideas in unconventional ways where there aren't really playbooks that explain for you to do something on your own. And so I'm hoping to build something that's more of an educational service, learning establishment for people that need a modern-day guidebook for how to navigate the new platforms of YouTube, social media, podcasting, Vine, and how to do it yourself without having corporate money or even venture-backed capital.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good things that you said, and I'm thinking back how I even got tipped off to your podcast. Brian Koppelman was the guy that or he was the interview that set it off for me as far as, making sure I listen to your podcast every week. He interviewed Seth Godin, and I didn't even know he even had a podcast. I didn't even know who Brian Koppelman was, honestly, up until about, August or September. And then, I'm checking, the podcast on my iPhone, and I see that you interviewed him. I was like, I don't know. I've never heard this influencer economy. I hit the little eye with the circle to get more info. I was like, this sounds pretty cool. I mean, like you said, there's a lot of similarities in, the pathways that anybody who's creating, something for a community has to go through. And I remember listening to the Brian Koppelman interview, and then I forget who the next one is, but then I listened to the one that you did with Flula, the YouTube guy, and I was completely sold because, and this is my next question. A lot of people, whether it's online or social media or, even like athletes and movie stars, they talk about the struggle, the trough where like nobody knows what you're doing. And like you said, it's hard to get your idea out to people. Share with us how like you just kept going. I mean, I just had a baby girl 2 weeks ago. So you're, 15, a year and change ahead of me, but I always just
congratulations.
Thank you. I mean, you talk about inspiration. That's a whole other level there. But can you talk to us just about like pushing? Like we hear about the struggle, or you got to believe. What does that mean? What does that mean for you, at least? What does that mean? Just saying, I have a proven track record in a whole completely different other field. How did you keep going after this?
Well, first of all, David, that's amazing news. So glad that you're in the no sleep club, no social life club, and the club of like all you have is work and baby at this point. So I get it. I'm surprised you're even doing these interviews. You're sleep deprived. But for just sort of like pushing through and doing stuff, it's like the Flula example I love as well. I'm really happy that resonated because Flula is such an unconventional person. And he's a German DJ, just to give a quick background, who's a big YouTuber now and has a massive audience. He's a comedian, DJ, hilarious guy. He ended up went to North Carolina for undergrad, moved to LA after college or after school, made a video, got like a decent following. Then he got deported back to Germany for whatever reason. He told me he couldn't. It was too much to even talk about. But he made a video in Germany about him being depressed, about not being in the U.S., and it made the front page of Reddit. And that was the catalyst. Like, we all need that one catalyst. Like, for me, it felt like my first episode was that. And I knew I wouldn't have a massive audience at first. Like you just said, not all of us will. But, like, a key component of the influencer economy is your first follower. And it's finding the first person to endorse you and give you that, kick in the pants that what you're doing is on the right track. And that first follower can give you not only confidence, but social proof. So the rest of the world knows what you're doing. And for Flula, getting on the front page of Reddit, 500,000 people gave him social proof. And that's when he knew that he was doing the right thing. And for my first guest, I had a guy, Bernie Burns. He started a company called Rooster Teeth, and they do online video, something like 3 billion YouTube video views over the history of their company, 10 million YouTube subscribers. And he started 10 years ago. His company just got acquired, actually, 3 months ago by a startup called Fullscreen. And the guy is so inspiring, so generous. I didn't have a podcast. My show didn't exist. I live in Los Angeles, like I mentioned. I went to the YouTube Space, which is a YouTube studio that they have out here. I went to this event. He was there. We met beforehand. I didn't know how to use my microphones. I didn't even have microphones. I just had the recorder. We're down we couldn't find a space, so we went to down this hallway, and doors are slamming, and I'm like, oh, this is loud. But Bernie just gave me 25 minutes of a great interview. And I was lucky because Bernie had been getting interviews for 10 years. So even the most simple questions he answered amazingly. So everyone that heard the podcast was like, Dan, you're a good interviewer. And I know I'm an interviewer, but I'm much better now than I was then. But he totally was like leading the interview. And that was the catalyst, because even though the audience wasn't massive, but because I went to the event, I met Flula there. Flula did my theme music on the Influencer Economy podcast. He then was my fourth guest. I met Taryn Southern, Shira Lazar, who both were my second and third guests. Because I got Bernie, I met Freddie Wong, who was my eighth guest. And then I got Adam Kovic and Bruce Green from Machinima as like my ninth guest. So really, like the first 7 or 8 guests became the real, because Bernie gave me my first follower, and he was that. He endorsed me. And then the social proof helped validate me into the YouTube market. And this is advice I always give people when they want to start and do something really well, is to pick a focused area. And there's a few ways to think about it, but it's called play the hand you're dealt. Play the hand you're dealt. So if you're starting a podcast, you're starting a brand, don't go and become like the big food guy if you only cook as a hobby. But if you're, the golf guy, start off like you're doing, like on the golf path and the sports path. And once I quote my father-in-law, he knows his universe better than anyone else in the world. He's a boiler maker, repair guy in North Carolina, has his own small business, very successful in the Southeast. And he knows the universe where he lives in better than anyone else. He knows boilers ins and outs, the rates, how to fix them, his competition. And because of knowing his own universe, he can talk to me about startup culture and entrepreneurship and YouTube videos and my podcast business, because he knows the universe that he lives in and therefore can understand the bigger universes out there. And so I say, find your first follower for social proof is something that, was massive for me. And then playing the hand I was dealt, because I worked in the YouTube startup ecosystem for 5 or 6 years, back before YouTube became the juggernaut, when there were a lot of different websites doing video. And this is back, right after YouTube got acquired by Google. So I've been in this world. I know a lot of YouTube creators. So my first shows were with YouTube creators. And that's how I understood like the first segment of the influencer economy and what I was trying to create. And then finally, once I figured out the YouTube, and got the keys to unlocking that economy and how it worked together, I realized, okay, that's the universe I know. I know it so intimately I can expand to other universes. So then I went to self-published authors for guests on my podcast. I went to talk to podcasters on my show. I talked to more entrepreneurs, more founders of companies. I reached Brian Koppelman, and who's a multimedia type personality. And so, there's a lot of catalysts, but for me, I think those were the main elements.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said, it takes so much. You actually have to do the work. That's one thing that inherently a lot of people will say when they're starting off, like, oh, well, I'm not scared of, putting in the work and putting in the time. Well, okay, that's great. But a lot of times the fear of not, you were explaining how Bernie Burns hooked you up in the interview. And I remember listening to that interview. You were like, does the camera go here? And I was like, oh, man, this dude is doing it. I mean, anybody who's ever interviewed somebody else, not for a book report, not for a paper, just like for something that you're doing, man, you're sweating bullets, like you should be if you care, So everything that you're saying, it's a process of taking small leaps and small chunks, and then, sooner or later, you start to see that you're starting to get this snowball effect starting to just happen. And one question I'm thinking of is, did you like send out emails to people to say, hey, I want to interview, or did you just say, hey, Bernie, do you know anybody else who I can interview? Did you do it the referral route, or did you do sort of the outbound thing?
I did like what I call the kitchen sink approach, where I threw every reasonable avenue of the kitchen sink out there. I just went after it. And so I think, getting podcast guests, and I'm actually writing a book So I have an ebook. If anyone wants to email me at ryan@influencereconomy.com, it's a playbook about starting podcasts, and that's free. But I'm writing an ebook. I'm almost done with it for how to launch your podcast, and it's be published by Stories from the Influencer Economy. And so I've diagrammed the different approaches for getting guests. And for me, like for starters, it was warm introductions and talking to my friends at Machinima, who were big gaming YouTube talent people, getting introductions. I met Bernie through a former colleague. I ran social media at Machinima, and the person who took my place, I was friends with her, Rachel. She hooked me up with Bernie, and that was helpful because, like, when you do warm introductions before you launch, that's really all you got, because you need a product, and you can't really start reaching out to people in a cold email fashion until you actually have something to share and show them that they can touch. And again, that's why I get back to Bernie, like how it was really validating, because Bernie, Shira, Taryn, Flula, like I got a bunch of interviews before I launched, to have in the hopper. They took a chance, like this thing may not even taken off. And think about all the people that either don't start their podcast because they don't have the time or they don't have the focus, like you're mentioning, like you got to put the work in. Imagine like the people that have been, like I know friends and companies in LA that they've banked like 10 or 15 episodes for podcasts, and they're afraid to launch. They're afraid it won't be perfect.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. And then you get people that like launch and do one podcast. And they do one episode, and then they don't publish again for another 6 weeks, but then they still, call themselves a podcaster. And I think you got to find out like what works best for you. But yeah, I think at first warm introductions are helpful, and I think cold emails are like the most underrated thing that no one really appreciates in our world, like how like much response you can get from a cold email. And like the amount of guests I've gotten just through emailing them and Twitter, it's a lot. People that you send them your website, you ask them the questions, you give them a time to meet, you make it really easy for them, and all they have to do is just show up and in person or over Skype. The world is flat. You can reach anyone now. And that's the beautiful thing about podcasting, especially for anyone out there who's listening, starting a podcast, always go after, as guests, like people that are fellow podcasters, because we all know what it's like, and we know how hard it is to get guests at first, and they're going to be most likely the most responsive to come on your show.
Wow, that's awesome. It's funny because I'm trying to think of I'm trying to be selfish. I'm trying to think of how I can make this about myself.
Let's do it. Let's spend the next time on call. Let's talk about you.
Okay, fair enough.
Let's do it. The audience is going to love it. The listeners will love it because they want to know more about you and me and like our personalities and how we collaborate.
Oh, I'm not even worried about it. I'm just laughing that this is actually happening. So I'm thinking of selfishly everything that you said, and I'm doing it. I'm doing it. I've been doing it for 13, 14 months now. And the crazy thing is that it's, like I said, it's not hard at all. It's 2015 now. Technologically speaking, the only barrier is you wanting to do it or not, for the most part. There's no price barrier. There's no knowledge barrier for the most part. So a question I have for you, how do you think about scale? Do you think about, like, when I say scale, I mean as far as, like, say you have the next 5 weeks planned out. Are you thinking about going wider, getting more people in in different fields? Or are you just saying, hey, I'm going to do these 5, and then I send out my interview requests at this time, and we'll just take it piece by piece? What's your take on that?
I used to do that, and I would say I'm only want to talk to these types of people or that kind of person or these people, and it would work for me at first because the show was, something that I was figuring out how I could produce a weekly content around. And getting a weekly show up is no small feat. And it takes a lot of time to figure out the process. Because if you do a podcast, it can take over, right? Editing and sound. I mean, sound is so important. Looking to guests, doing research, it could take a lot more time up than anyone has. And so about 7 months in, I started treating it more like a product. And that's how I'm looking at everything I'm doing now, is their products. Because if I don't see them like that, then I can suddenly spend 25 hours on one episode and get frustrated staying up late at night to try to, fix stuff that doesn't need fixing. And essentially the way I look at it is, if you can do a weekly show, that's great. And so for me, I'm completely doubling down on podcasting this year. And I'm doubling down on books. I'm going to publish more mini ebooks. I think that we're in such a drastic transformation for, the radio era ending, on-demand audio, podcasting is here, the serial phenomenon and startup podcasts, This American Life, all those types of shows have really catalyzed podcasting to become more normal. And I think only more and more people are starting to podcast. And the sooner people can get their iTunes account set up with a podcast and get their show launched, the better there be. And I watched this happen when I was working with YouTubers. The Freddie Wongs of the world, the Flulas of the world, the Bernie Burns, they're great. They're super talented and really successful. But one of the reasons why was they were first adopters, and they were there early. And Freddie Wong was on YouTube before it was even monetizable, and he was just making videos. And podcasting, I'm seeing a very similar trend here, where the sooner you start a regular show with a regular listening base, the more potential you have to succeed in the long run. And for me, I'm going to go to twice-a-week shows. And so I've spent the new year, I've come back, and I've got a lot of interviews lined up. I'm getting a lot of listeners suggesting people to interview, which is actually a newer thing that's only happened in the last 3 or 4 months. And then those people are offering to put me in touch with the people that they think would like the show. So a lot of the community is a lot more involved, and that's helped me open my scope more, because if you only limit it to okay, I only want a YouTube or podcast guest, or for you even, you're doing golf and sports type content, and then you're having someone like me on now. I think once you know your universe, you can do whatever you want. But for me, I was always worried of the integrity of the show. So if I'm ever nervous about going too broad with a guest, I'll email a few listeners and take a litmus test to see if they think they'd be interested in hearing the guest.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that was one of my fears, because I did 6 month span beginning of 14. All I did was golf interviews. I did 30-something golf interviews. And for me, it was just one of those things where I just got to a point where I was like, man, I just can't compartmentalize what I'm talking about just to golf anymore. I feel not even selfish. I feel like that'd be a dumb move. Another question I have for you, just thinking about it now. I mean, did you ever do anything like this beforehand? Was this just you just saying, I'm just going to do it, or did you interview people and record them for the prior entrepreneurship type things and startups, or is this something that you just said, I'm going to do this, I'm going to figure it out, I'm going to do this?
Yeah, well, I used to do stand-up comedy. I lived on the East Coast before I moved to L.A. in Washington, D.C., so I've performed before. I've done comedy. I had a comedy booking company in Washington, D.C., playing comedy festivals and book gigs at restaurants, bars, and clubs. And so I've performed before, but as my wife will tell me now, I wasn't funny. So I haven't really put myself out there like this since then, and that was back in maybe 8-9 years ago. So really, I've been on the business side, and the process of going into business with entrepreneurs and startups I've worked for, and the experiences I've had, and getting acquired by Disney and going through that process, I would never have gotten to this stage of the creative process if I hadn't gone through those failures and those successes. And so all of that business experience is baked into the podcast, and now it's just me. and I figured I'm going to do it or not. I may as well do it now. And no, I hadn't had any experience. I mean, I hadn't interviewed people. I like to talk a lot. I'm curious by nature, and I actually am a very good connector of people, and I can build relationships pretty quickly. So I thought that all those skills would transfer into this, but it wasn't something that I felt like I had a lot of experience actually packaging it together. Like, I had never edited before. I wasn't a sound engineer. Like, a lot of that stuff I just winged. And so the process itself, no, I had not done it before.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with you. I keep thinking in my head, I'm running back all the interviews that I like all the interviews simply because, I mean, honestly, as a listener to your podcast, one of the things I like about your style and your approach is that, first of all, I know how it's going to end, which we'll talk about at the very end, your outro, which I think is clutch. I've never heard anything like that before. But secondly, you just have a variety of guests, and these experts, because they're all experts in their own way, these experts are all creators or on the forefront of things that we're all very aware of. Maybe we're not necessarily in the industry, but we know what's going on. So whether it's Flula or Ty Hildenbrandt or I'm blanking on some names now, but they're all like creators. And one of the cool things that I've just sort of realized over the last couple of months is, like, you know, if you're interviewing people and you're interviewing people who are doing things on a high level, that high level, they have a lot of similarities. So whether you're talking about a golfer or a musician or heck, a watchmaker or a YouTube producer, their thought process and just attacking the unknown is, to me, it's just awe-inspiring, because we don't necessarily get to see behind greatness a whole lot. You know, like, I mean, how many times have we, except for podcasting now, which is what you're talking about, how many times do we get to really see, can't think of a band right now, John Legend make an album, you know, from scratch. You know, we don't get to necessarily grill him about how he's made that album. We don't get to sit down in honesty with somebody like Tom Brady or Rory McIlroy and just talk about the dark days, because that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't really translate, or let's be honest, they don't want it to translate because they want to protect their image. And that's fine, but I just love how you have a diverse type of experts on your show, but there's always a thing, whether it's Brian Koppelman or Flula. I mean, you might, like, there's something there that me as a listener, I can pull away each episode and say, okay, David, I need to work on this episode. I know you don't necessarily plan that, but what are some things that you've gotten out of interviewing these guys from just diverse backgrounds and working environments?
Yeah, a lot, tons. I mean, I've left. So I interviewed Troy Carter, who I bring this up for many reasons. One is he manages John Legend now, and so in that episode he talks about what it's like making an amazing song with John Lennon and realizing it's a hit. And so Troy used to work with. I'll tell you actually, this sort of like. I'll tell you one story. This is how I got Troy on the show. So, and this plays into exactly the type of person he was, and the skills that I've been able to nurture through the podcast. I strongly believe in teaching, that anyone in our industry should teach. It helps you become more of an expert. It helps you become more assertive, and it helps people get smarter. It's a win-win for everyone across the board. Even if you don't get paid to do it, just like help people, mentor, all of the above. So I teach in LA for this school, and they were having an event and I teach a marketing class, and it's about launching your ideas, and I'm doing webinars for this as well. But my whole passion is like getting people out there and just getting them starting to do stuff and create, and getting rid of the barriers that we all have of like just starting something. And so they have this event. The Troy Carter, who's he's an investor, he's an angel investor in like Uber, Dropbox, Lyft, all these big startups, and used to manage Lady Gaga, now manages John Legend, John Mayer, Meghan Trainor, who I didn't even know of at the time. when I interviewed him, but now she's blown up. So I'm at this event. I'm in the crowd. This tech writer is interviewing Troy. It's at like the Soho House event thing, whatever, in LA, and very like hip people are there and they want to talk about tech. And so I was like, hey, I raised my hand. I'm like, you mentioned earlier, Troy, that you managed Biggie Smalls and worked with Puff Daddy back in Philly. How did you hook up with those guys, and what's Biggie Smalls' legacy on hip hop? And the whole crowd's like, what? What's he like looking at me like laughing, like what is this guy asking? And I was like, oh yeah, by the way, that's a non-tech question. Because they're all like, hey, let's talk about Uber and Dropbox, and what do you look for? How can I meet you? I want to be a startup guy and whatever. So I'm like, screw that. Like, I want to get real. Like, that's sorry to swear, but that's really interesting. Like, that's what I come to events for, because I want to get interesting content. And I can find Troy video online about his investor track record. But so Troy turns around. I'm in the front row. He looks at me like 7 minutes. He's like, well, I was doing this, that, Philly, and that. I was a club promoter. I was doing shows. They missed their gig in New York, so they came late to Philly, and they didn't make good. I could tell Biggie was a good guy, and it was amazing. Like, the best answer. Afterwards, people were like, dude, that was a great question. So I got to get this guy on my show. And I emailed him and said, hey, I was the guy that asked the question about Biggie Smalls' legacy. Like, I talk about this kind of stuff on the influencer economy. And he had mentioned that Lady Gaga, like, when she tweets out stuff, people think that they're going to move the needle with the tweet, but it's really not the fact when you look at the science. So it's like, hey, look, I think people influential and verticals are a lot more, impactful than celebrities. Come on my podcast, let's talk about hip-hop and entrepreneurship. He got back to me in like 6 hours, and we scheduled a meeting. I talked to him for 45 minutes. It was the coolest office I've ever seen. And I got like the most real conversation with him. And at the very end of the talk, I asked him a few questions about, how do investors or how do entrepreneurs meet you? How do artists meet you? And he said, like, John Legend is his biggest client referral. Like, that's the joke at the Atom Factory, because I guess John Legend just keeps giving him people to manage. And he says at the very end, I was like, how do I, like, who do you want to work with? And he's like, I want to work with people, and he gets close, that are willing to die for their idea. Like, they want this idea so badly to make it happen, they're willing to consider death. Because if you don't do that, nothing's ever going to happen for you. And it was like being in the locker room with, like, Vince Lombardi. I felt like I wanted to, like, run through a brick wall for this guy and be like, I'm passionate, like, I felt so, like, energized when I left. Like, I'd love to work for this guy. Like, that's the passion I want. And that was one of those encounters that the whole thing, how it played out from getting him, asking him how it happened, like, that kind of stuff, if you don't do something like a podcast or a project that puts yourself out there where you're taking risk and really betting on yourself, then you're never going to get it.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, one of the questions I like to ask creators and athletes and people of any level of success. I mean, when you think about all the risks that you've overcame and the sleep that you've lost, the friends that you've lost, let's just say extracurricular activities that you don't do anymore, you can't do to the level that you used to be able to do prior, has it been worth it? I mean, this is sort of a trick question in a sense, but I mean, all the things that you had to give up to pursue success, pursue the opportunities to be an influencer, to connect, has it been worth it for you?
I mean, it depends on, like, the metrics you use. For me, like, yeah, professionally, I've never been more invigorated, energized, excited about, what I'm doing and the hard work I'm putting in, and it's a longer term opportunity. And for me, like, making more money this year is, like, the major priority, because now I do have a daughter. The stuff, making free podcasts, I've had ads on the podcast, but, that's not money that you're really going to help better your life with in the long run. And so anyone that does this, you just have to be willing to say, look, like, I'm not going to crush it right now, but I'm investing in people, relationships, and opportunities that are going to hopefully pay dividends in the future. So for me, like in that Brian Koppelman episode, we talked about it. It's like I've had trouble articulating what I do to people that aren't in this world that we live in. And his advice was like, tell people that you're reevaluating yourself as a professional, and you're reinventing yourself as a storyteller. And I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. But my friends in college that all went down like the real estate path, or a very traditional career opportunity pathway for them, like, they don't really understand it, and it's fine. It's like I sort of just don't want to talk to those people at this point. It just because they don't get it, right? They're going to ask, like, what are you doing now? Like, why, when's your book coming out? And you're like, well, it's not the book. It's the process around it that matters.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, yeah. I mean, it makes me think, and by the way, 2 more questions. I know you're on a tight schedule here. 2 more questions, and what you just said is one of the toughest things about creating anything, the people around you. How have you just almost steeled yourself to where, you don't have to worry about your wife and your daughter. Like, they're always going to be behind you for the most part. But those guys that you grew up with, those guys that you're your buddies with, have you almost like found like a new set of friends, a new set of peers, which, that's what I've found. I found like as I take more risk and I reach out more and I build connections with other people and your connection economy, the influencer economy, like I'm finding more and more people that get it. And the people that don't get it, it's almost like, it's not that I shun, but it's almost like I have very different it's more of like at best an acquaintance relationship. It's more like, oh, how are you doing? Oh, things are great. What's new? Well, still working on stuff, blah, 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 blah. It's almost like you're more bland, but the people who get it, like, you just open up to. Have you experienced that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's the tricky part is for me, like I said, it's all a long game. It's all a long process. And I care about 5 years from now, not 5 days from now, as far as what I'm building. And people don't see that, and they don't get it. And they have their own insecurities and their own anxieties or their own judgment. And for me, like, I can hang out with anyone fairly easily. It's people that don't see the long term here, that I'm laying like what I think is a very strong foundation down that will last me the rest of my life. That those people I just don't have. I don't see as often. And I cut cut out the time with them because it's almost like updates, right? Like, I think in social environments, like, whenever you see somebody you haven't seen in a while, you just give them an update. Like, and it depends on the relationship you have with those types of folks. And some people that you give updates to, it's like the bulletin you give them is they want to hear all the great things you're doing professionally. And you're like, well, do you have like 4 hours? Because these are like very complicated things that, like, if you are on my level, like, just not like being cocky, but if you're on my level of like how I think and how most of my friends think, then I can articulate this to you, and you will get it. So, for example, I'm going to see a friend of mine for dinner next week, college friend, and he's in real estate. He went to business school. He'll be excited for me when we talk about this kind of stuff, but it's not like the regular conversation I really want to have, where, like, I'm having an update session with him. So he'll like he'll ask me how the book's coming, of course, because he knows it, and he's happy that I'm writing a book, but he doesn't know how to write a book in 2015. He thinks that, like, you get a book deal and throw it in a store, and then Barnes & Noble sells it, and that's not the case anymore. So, so yeah, I'll hang out with him, but I mean, I don't know. I just sort of like figure out, like, friends sort of happen organically, and for me, like, my friends are like my fans, really, and they're my biggest advocates, and They're the people that like drop anything for me and like do something stupid like tweet the podcast, right? Like, or just, you know, like that stuff is so like it's so basic, but like that's what friends do when you're like taking risks like we are. Like they get it. They realize that like, and the worst friends, I have one friend who like, I asked him to help me with something and he'll like remind me that he helped me. I'm like, dude, that's not the fucking point. We're not here to like keep track of our favors that we do for each other. So yeah, it's just a very complicated, delicate balance. But in the end, I mean, it's like people judge you by the results. And some people only want to judge you by the results. And I'm not someone, I'm much stronger belief in the process, and that's the end game.
Yeah, to me, that's the only reason why I even had the nerve to get a website, to get hosting, to learn how to interview, to write. The end game. The end game is all that matters, you know. And if your end game is 5 months from now, then you're kind of stuck. If it's 5 days from now, you shouldn't even start. If it's 5 years from now, or 15 years from now, or you know, like you said, depending on your metric, if it's way out in the future, you have more than enough time to build that bridge to it. And yeah. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, we always act out what we end up creating what we really want if we're pushed enough by it. And like you were saying with Troy Carter, sometimes, you know, you get somebody to say it to you. Other times you get random fans doing things crazy, like doing promotion and marketing for you. I mean, that's a great problem to have, you know. Other times, you know, it's in a slightly darker period of time where you're just like, man, how am I going to make this work? But at the end of the day, you're going to create what you see. And I think that's what you're thinking.
The greatest thing you can do is get like one piece of feedback a day. I think if you can get one random person that you've never met giving you feedback. They could say you suck, but as long as they're saying something, that's what keeps you going.
Yeah.
You know, if you start getting people that are beyond your friend network, just like doing something, whether it's tweeting it, writing an email that you suck, which someone did the other day, and I was delighted by it because at least I knew they were listening. And then I ended up emailing with them, and they actually told me they liked me at the end. And they told me they bought 3 books because of the podcast that they heard mentioned. So in the end, it worked. It was great. The guy's like now a big supporter, but he hated it. He told me my show was, he's like, I love what you're doing, but you need to get better at interviewing. And he's like, you really interrupt your guests all the time. And I'm like, what? You know, and then he tells me like what shows, and then he's like, but actually I've listened to 10 episodes, and I just told my whole office to listen to your show. So maybe I can get over the fact that I think you've interrupted a few questions.
Yeah, maybe, right?
Yeah.
Maybe. That's interesting. It's always interesting to people who actually have the, I'm just going to call it nerve or the audacity to actually reach out and talk to you, and they're overly critical. It's funny.
I love it, though. I mean, I think it's great. At least they care.
Yeah, and that was my point. I mean, it's funny because they have all this just straight venom they want to dump on you, and, you know, for me, it's like I get an email. It's like, hey, I'm glad you even replied back. How many times do we get emails or, you know, do we send stuff and people don't even reply back because they could care less? You know, I mean, you're either hot or you're cold, you know, in my book. But,
well, do you have any guest? I have a question for you before we go. Do you have any guest suggestions?
Oh, for your show?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm a pretty simple guy, and I like sports a lot, and I think that the only interview that I have not listened to, I don't know why, is the Harrison Barnes interview. Keep listening to all the other ones. Keep going back and listening to all the old ones. So I say that, and I don't necessarily mean like an athlete. One of the things that I'm chasing after right now are people who are creating around something. So guys who are making fantasy football apps, or they're doing analytics or whatever, because it is mind-boggling the depth of precision and knowledge that these guys have. So that'd be what I would say. And maybe I could even send you some after we do after this interview, because I just think that the sports world, there's more to it than just LeBron James and Kyrie Irving not doing it in Cleveland. Like, there's so much more to it. There's entire billion-dollar industries that are around, like fantasy sports, So just that's where I come from. I love hearing more about sports and the other industries and niches and careers around it.
Okay, cool. Did you listen to the Jonah Carey episode?
That was another episode that was straight, like, I mean, and I could talk about this all day, so that's my disclaimer, but you got to just do stuff, and that was one of the episodes. I was actually painting the nursery when I listened to that episode, so getting a little jaded by smelling all the paint. You just got to do stuff. You got to do stuff. Yeah, you don't. Yeah. You want stuff to work out, but like, you can't even worry about it. You just got to do stuff. This is a guy who was posting on the Expos forum. I'm not saying that like that's good or bad, but it's like, at what point are you going to trust yourself to say, hey, no, I can write about that? And I remember the last thing I'll say, the coolest thing about that interview, amongst other things, was him saying how the job he wanted to do that he pitched, like, I think ESPN or, magazines or networks to do, they said, oh, well, you can't do that. And now Darrell Rovell's doing it,
Yeah.
That part
years later, Rovell's doing it, exactly. I liked it when he was talking about how he said everything you do, somebody is noticing.
Yeah.
No matter what you think, he's like, no matter what you think, no one's out there listening or reading or seeing what you're doing. Like, someone is noticing what you're doing. And so, like, if you have a baseline level of skill and you're a hard worker, then, luck will happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's great. I love that guy.
Yeah, that, I don't know how I forgot about that interview, but yeah, that was one of the interviews where I was like, oh man, I don't know if it's the paint or just the content.
You're right. That was good. And then he almost like was ready to like be critical of Darren Rovell, if you noticed.
Yeah.
And then he's like, well, Darren does his own thing. I probably wouldn't have been as brand focused as he was.
Yeah.
And I could tell that he was like, he didn't really care what he said, but he didn't like come across as just like, yeah, I wouldn't have been a sellout like Rovell.
Yeah, that's one thing where, again, like I said, I always have a sports slant. It just keeps me interested. It's just me being honest. And
okay.
all things being equal, like when Jonah Carey writes an article about baseball or about anything business related, contracts, like you just jump into it. I would read Darren Rovell stuff and follow his Twitter feed, and it's like, I don't even know what to say. I don't even want to even go there, but it's like, yeah, it's just shallow,
It's so shallow. It's so corporate. It's shallow.
That's the word. That's the word.
He's very image conscious, and Jonah Carey is like the voice of the fan. He's the guy that likes baseball, likes to think about it differently than your traditional general manager, and using new data and statistics. Rovell's like a corporate entity that just churns out content, Gatorade and Bud Light. It's like he's very well manicured.
Yeah, and to each his own, and he's going to have a job for as long as he wants. But then that's the rub, isn't it? Like, Darren Rovell has a job. Jonah Carey is doing whatever the heck he wants, and that's what pulled me, because that's the end game. The end game is never.
Dude, you said that so well. Darren Rovell has a job, and Jonah Carey can do what he wants. He can write books. He can host podcasts. He can he can write for Grantland.com. Yeah, you're right. That's a great way to say it.
Yeah.
I've actually interacted with Rovell. I've met him a few times, and he was very prickly, very very cocky.
Imagine that. Well, Yeah, I don't think a guy like Jonah Carey would be like that. And I'm not trying to make this mano a mano or anything, but it's like, yeah, of course.
But dude, this is the thing, and this is like a big theme of the podcast is like, you got to be accessible. Like if you want to be creative in the space, you've got to be accessible. You can't be a walled garden. You can't be a paywall that people have to access you through certain channels because you're so, the Biggie Smalls best line of all time is never get high on your own supply. And so many people in media that are, especially on ESPN or like bigger personality networks, they're talking heads and they're so caught up in their own BS. But Jonah Carey comes on my podcast, and yeah, it helps that I've had like Ty Hilton, who was on Grantland's network for a while, and I do have that credibility that he wasn't just coming on a random show. But you've got to give back, and you've got to like help people that were in your shoes, and you nailed it. Like Darren Rovell has his job, and Jonah Carey can do what he wants.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that the goal? That's our goal, right?
I mean, no questions asked. Like what you want to. Of those two guys, who you want to be?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I hate to say this, but I got to go in a minute.
Well, we have one question. The last question. It's an easy one. Every single podcast, you end it by saying that you're headed to Duke Zebert's to get some chicken in the pot. Elaborate, please, because every time I hear it, I have like a little laugh. And I'm like, man, what the heck is he talking? I even Googled it yesterday, and I was like, this is not helping.
Oh, man. So I hinted at it in my last episode this week. But so when I was a kid, I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. And this is a very long story, but I will do my best to give you the Cliff Notes. And I called Larry King's radio show. And my brother called Larry King's radio show. This is before he had his TV show. He wasn't a global icon at this point. He did radio and TV, and he was very much not like a celebrity. So my brother called him up, and my brother would make fun of Larry King and do dirty jokes and, like, prank call him, essentially. I was like, what, I'm going to call Larry and become friends with him. So my brother was, like, hung up on. He did this thing called Open Phones America. So the last hour of his show, anyone could call, and they didn't screen the calls. It was really like a podcast in some sense, taking calls, and you could ask him anything. My brother would do, like, rude jokes, and I would call and say, hey, Larry, it's the Red Baron, and I had a nickname, and he'd be like, hey, Red Baron, hello, I see you in the sky. And so I've, like, met Larry King, like, multiple times in my life, all because I called his radio show as the Red Baron. And my voice was a lot more high-pitched back then. I was, like, 11 years old and, talked very much like a squeaky mouse. But we met first time we met was at this restaurant called Duke Zebert's in Washington, D.C., and so every time when Larry would end his Open Phones America radio show, he would say, I'm heading to Duke Zebert's for some chicken in the pot, or the matzo ball soup's going to be good tonight. So he had this ongoing joke that even though the radio show ended at like 11 o'clock at night, he would go to Duke's. And Duke was his old-school Washington, D.C. steak owner, and the Washington Redskins Super Bowl trophies they were housed at Duke Zebert's because Duke was best friends with Jack Kent Cooke, who owned the team back then. So I'm like an 11-year-old kid, and like I call the phone. I'm like, Larry, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. He's like, come to Duke Zebert's. And so like he puts me on hold, and I talk to his producer, and like I get my family all together. We all dressed up. I'm wearing like the red sweater because I'm the Red Baron, and I have like red hair. And we like show up in our Sunday best at this steakhouse in DuPont Circle, Washington, D.C. Larry comes over and like in his suspenders, like, hey, the Red Baron, how you doing? And Duke Zebert's like, hey, Red Baron, I heard you on the phone last night. And so we went to Duke Zebert's, and then when I moved to L.A., I saw Larry when I was out here at another steakhouse, and we talked, and I met his family. I saw his TV show tape live like a few years back anyway, so I keep running into Larry, and he's always like, the Red Baron, hello. And, come sit down. And, like he's like, meet my family, tell them about the radio show days. So as an homage to my early days of calling a radio show, that's my outro.
That's awesome. Well, from an avid and loyal listener, that's an awesome sewing up of that, because I was always like, man, what is he talking about? I like it, but I don't know what he's talking about. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Well, Ryan, man, I feel like we're going to talk more in the future, but thank you for coming on to the show. This is a great talk, and hey, if we learn anything, right, you got to be accessible. Don't be corporate, right?
Exactly. You can't be corporate.